Thank you.
All right, and I will look to our court reporter. Are we ready to go back on the record? I don't actually see her in the room, so I'm going to wait a few more moments.
Ms. Kunze, we did have a housekeeping matter we wanted to raise. I don't know if you want to wait for the court reporter or not.
Let's wait just for a moment.
Okay.
Please. See if we can just. Does anyone have, I don't know which of the parties, if all of you are working with the court reporter, if you have heard anything about the status. I don't want to start before she's able to join us unless.
We've received no, we've have no communication.
Okay.
No. I'll check again though, but I don't believe so.
Great. Welcome back. We were just wondering where our lovely.
I'm
court reporter
sorry.
was.
I have plumbing
That's okay.
problems today and the plumbers are giving me a hassle. I'm ready to go when you are.
I don't mean to rush you, but I think it sounds like you're ready and I'm ready. So let's go back on the record. And I think there was, before we get started with cross-examination, there was one housekeeping item to discuss.
Yes, Ms. Kunze, earlier today you suggested that we could have a panel with really what I guess would be our remaining four witnesses. Mr. Schwartz, Mr. Cullen, Mr. Clegg, and Mr. Anthony. We would request that you modify that somewhat for a couple of reasons. Well, primarily because Mr. Clegg is the city manager for Bakersfield. He has some other commitments tomorrow. We were hoping that he could be the next witness after the cross-examination of these three witnesses, and then have him and then have Mr. Anthony go next. And their testimony is going to be very short, particularly in light of your evidentiary rulings. And then the thought would be they could be a panel together because they are somewhat distinct. They're both city officials who give similar testimony. And we could have their cross-examination after they each provide a summary of their testimony, and then have Mr. Cullen and Schwartz give their testimony. And then those two could be a panel, which also makes sense because they're both outside experts and consultants.
That seems sensible to me. Are there any concerns with that approach?
North Kern has no objection. That's fine.
Thank you.
Thank
Good.
you.
Then let's do that. That sounds fine with me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other housekeeping matters from you or any of the other parties before we begin? All right, then if you would please, if we can have Mr. Chavez, Mr. Chianello, and Mr. Kaur available for questions. And I will, I think the general order will be, I will look to Mr. Cooney and North Kern first for cross-examination. I don't know if you're working with the city of Shafter or the city of Shafter may have separate questions. That it doesn't matter to me. And then I will look to the other parties for cross-examination. That was my intent.
And that's just fine for us. And we are in coordination with the city of Shafter. So we'll start the process and then others can do as they see fit.
Thank you.
So we would start then with Mr. Core. So if he needs to get to the right room or whatever that mechanic is.
I see Mr. Core. It looks like you're currently muted, however.
No,
Oh, you're not. I see.
No.
Yes, you may have a different feed. Great, wonderful.
correct.
We're hoping to cut down on the audio issues, but we'll see.
Thanks.
I see Mr. Chianello, but I don't see Mr. Core. Is there a, maybe I need to,
You may need to change your view.
oh, up there. Okay, I can now. Very good. I've got all three. I've got, very good. Hey, that's perfect. Whatever that,
We did that.
did that
We started,
magic trick, that's perfect.
Good.
Well, good afternoon, Mr. Core. It's very good to see you again.
Good afternoon.
Now, you have testified before the State Water Board previously on this matter back in 2010. Is that correct?
Yes,
And is it also correct, Mr. Core, that you are not a licensed attorney in the state of California?
that is correct.
You're not a licensed attorney in any state of the United States, are you?
I am not.
And likewise, you have no formal legal education or training from any accredited law school, is that right?
That's correct.
And similarly, you have never been qualified in any court of law or administrative tribunal as an expert witness competent to testify and provide opinions with regard to matters of California water rights or contract interpretation. Is that also true?
That's true.
If I could have, I believe it is Miss Mullins, is that correct? If you could pull up Bakersfield 32, please. That's great. And Mr. Core, you can see that as well. Is that true?
Yes.
Very
Yes.
good. So this is a copy of a blank City of Bakersfield Kern River First Point Flow and Diversion record that had been prepared by the City of Bakersfield in the 2010 State Board proceedings. Is that right?
It's a, I'm not sure if it was the 2010, but yes, it is a flow and diversion record, blank.
It's a blank form. And then on top of that, there's been some color highlighting and some additional information. Is that right?
Yes.
And I'll call it Rose. This color under the box North Kern, those are all of the diversion rights that are listed in the 1952 agreement administered by North Kern Water Storage District. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so it starts with the Kern County Canal Entitlement second point, and then it has the James first, the Anderson first, et cetera, all the way down on the flow and diversion record. Is that right?
Yes.
And all of those flow and diversion rights that are listed on this form are listed in their order of right of priority, with the highest priority being at the top of the sheet and the lowest priority being at the bottom of the sheet. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So for the example, for North Kern, jumping over the second point right, the first point right, the James first, there is the first diversion right in the 1952 agreement. And then the last right under the 52 agreement is the Pioneer second at the bottom of the sheet or towards the bottom. Is that right?
Yes.
And then also on this sheet is colored in green, diversion rights with regard to the Kern Delta Water District, starting with the Kern Island first and then going all the way to the bottom of the sheet to the Kern Island second. Those are rights of Kern Delta, is that right?
Yes,
Okay. And the first priority one is the Kern Island first. That's the first priority right on the Kern River, is that right?
yes, it is.
And the last priority right is the Kern Island second on the sheet, is that right?
Yes,
And they're all listed in the Shaw Decree, right?
everything's listed in the Shaw Decree except the Kern River conduit.
Okay, very good. And that's a city right, is that right?
Correct.
Okay. That brings me to the yellow. The yellow are the rights that the city of Bakersfield administers, and you brought out the first one. That's the Kern River conduit, correct?
Yes,
Okay, and that doesn't even have a diversion amount, does it?
it does not.
Okay. It's not an appropriative right, is it?
I'm going to interpose an objection that calls for a legal conclusion, and it's also beyond the scope of his direct testimony.
Well, Mr. Core, you're familiar with the city of Bakersfield's water rights, are you not?
Yes,
Well, you know,
And you're
Mr. Cooney,
familiar-
I did raise an objection. I'd like to have it ruled on before Mr. Cooney continues his question.
Well, let's consider the question withdrawn at the moment and go ahead, Mr. Cooney, on this line. You may come, I mean, we'll come back to it and see how it presents itself.
Thank you.
You're familiar with the city of Bakersfield's Kern River rights, is that correct?
yes,
And the Kern River conduit is one of those rights, correct?
yes,
Are you aware of whether that right is an appropriative right?
the right is a calculation from appropriative rights.
What's the calculation?
The calculation is the loss factor in delivering water from first point to second point, 6 months out of the year, March through August. And the contributing canals that comprise the what's called the Kern River conduit in the formula. It comes from the first point canals, appropriative right canals.
The Castro is also one of the city's rights, correct?
Yes,
And again, we don't need to go through all of them. The other yellow ones are the city of Bakersfield rights that it receives water, correct?
yes,
And it was the city of Bakersfield that colored these rights, distinguishing the city's rights from North Kern's rights. Is that right?
that's what I understand. Yes,
And then there's one other color we haven't talked about. That's the minor right. And there's only one, apparently, the South Fork right. Is that correct?
correct.
If Ms. Mullen could please pull up North Kern 41, please. Are you familiar with a contract entitled the Agreement for Use of Water Rights dated January 1, 1952?
Somewhat, yes.
You're just somewhat familiar with it?
I'm familiar with it. Yes,
Okay. Now that is a contract between the North Kern Water Storage District and the Kern County Land Company and the various canal companies that are listed in this first paragraph. Is that right?
yes,
And earlier you testified that the rights that were shown in Bakersfield 32 are those that are listed in the 1952 agreement. That's the same agreement you were just testifying to, right?
yes.
And if Ms. Mullen could scroll forward to, I think it will be your FTP page 2. It's page 2 of the agreement. There we go. Just a little bit higher, please. A little bit more. Let's go to where so we can show that. Perfect. That's good. Thank you. So this list that is included in the North Kern 1952 agreement lists the various diversion rights, priority dates, and quantity in cubic feet per second of all of those rights that the city of Bakersfield colored in rows on Exhibit 32, right?
Yes.
And again, they're listed in by name of the diversion right and by their date of priority, being the oldest, the earliest date all the way down to the latest date. And then they also list the cubic feet per second for each of those water rights. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes.
And if we did a comparison of the cubic feet per second in the right-hand column of the 1952 agreement and compared it to the amount column shown in column 2 of Bakersfield 32, that's the same figures, right, in cubic feet per second. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, you said you were somewhat familiar with this agreement. Were you born in 1952?
Yes, I was.
Okay. How old were you in 1952?
Under a year.
Under a year. Okay. So is it fair to say that you really have no personal knowledge as to the intent of the parties that signed this agreement in 1952? Is that fair?
You try that question again.
Can I have the court reporter please read it back?
Certainly. Under a year. Okay. So is it fair to say that you really have no personal knowledge as to the intent of the parties that signed this agreement in 1952? Is that fair?
I believe so, yes.
They didn't consult you when you were 1 year old, did they?
No.
Okay. Other than being able to read the document, do you have any direct personal knowledge as to the intent and meaning of any of the terms that are in agreement at North Kern 41, the 1952 agreement?
No, only what I've read.
Okay. Can I have Ms. Mullen, can you please pull up Bakersfield 26? It's quite a large document. And if you could just scroll down a little bit so we can just see the cover page initially. There you go. That's perfect. Thank you. Now, Mr. Core, are you familiar with agreement number 76-36, an agreement between the city of Bakersfield and Tenneco West?
Yes.
You were not personally involved or a witness to the drafting and execution of the city of Bakersfield 1976 agreement between the city or Tenneco West, though. Is that right?
No, I was not.
And in 1976, you were not working for the city of Bakersfield, right?
That's correct.
But you have read this agreement before today or not? Have you read it before?
I have read it before.
If Ms. Mullins can bring us to the 11th page of this exhibit. You should have page numbers at the bottom, I believe. Just scroll up just slightly more. That's great. Thank you very much. So now that we've turned to the 11th page of this agreement between the city and Tenneco, this paragraph titled Description of the Assets, paragraph 2.1. Why don't you take a moment just to familiarize yourself again with this and maybe read the first 3 sentences, and then I just wanted to ask you a question or two. You had a chance to read that, Mr. Core?
Yes.
Okay, so that paragraph says that all of the water assets the city is acquiring are, quote, subject to the terms, conditions, restrictions, and reservations set forth. And then it references an Exhibit A. Is that right?
Yes.
And if I could have Ms. Mullins, then let's go to Exhibit A. And I think we have it at the FTP site 17.
Is that a separate, Mr. Cooney, that maybe, did you mean a page number or is that a separate document?
There's an actual appendix called Exhibit A.
But is it in a separate PDF document?
No, it should all be
Okay.
attached if it was a cohesive,
Okay.
and I believe it is. I can also reference a Bates page if that is.
I think we were, from my guess from Ms. Mullins scrolling was that the page number changes. So she may be trying to offline trying to find.
And
the
it
right
is confusing. And unfortunately, these documents have been through several court proceedings, and so they all have a number of pages on them.
Right. Well, Ms. Mullen, just let us know if we can help, but take your time.
And actually, maybe try it would be maybe FTP page 97 to see if that helps. I'm sorry, maybe it's 97.
I think.
There we go. That is the page. Thank you. And if you
Wonderful.
could just,
Thank you.
well done. I'm sorry to make this so it's a little bit awkward. And if you could scroll just, or maybe shrink it a little bit because so I can make the question so it's be on one page. Yeah, that works, and hopefully I know that's hard on everybody's eyes. But so, Mr. Core, this again is the Exhibit A referenced in the earlier paragraph, talking about all of the agreements, decrees, and such that the city is taking subject to. And if you look sort of at the top third of that page, you're going to see the Miller-Hagan agreement reference. That's one of those agreements that was taken, the city took assets subject to, right? You see that?
Yes, I do.
And then right below that is the Shaw Decree. So they took their rights subject to the Shaw Decree. You see that?
Yes.
And then towards the bottom, third from the bottom, you see a reference to January 1, 1952, initials KCL NKWSD, Agreement for the Use of Water Rights. You see that?
Yes.
So it's your understanding that Bakersfield took all of its rights to water subject to the prior agreement between North Kern and the land company. Is that right?
Yes.
I meant to ask you this earlier, Mr. Core. You began working for the City of Bakersfield Water Department in 1980, correct?
That's correct.
You never worked for the Kern County Land Company, did you?
I did not.
And you never worked for the Kern County Canal and Water Company, did you?
No.
Okay. If Ms. Mullen could now pull up North Kern 32, and which is a very large document. So I want to give you a particular page to come to. It should be FTP page 2103. And for the hearing officer's benefit, North Kern 32 is the entire record of daily flow and diversion records from April 2007 through December of 2020, but I'm going to a particular point in time. So this is great. Thank you, Ms. Mullins. You've got right to it. So Mr. Corey, you can see this, can you not?
Yes.
And in your work for the City of Bakersfield, you're familiar with City of Bakersfield, Kern River, First Point flow and diversion records, both daily and monthly, is that right?
Yes.
And this first sheet is actually a December 2007 recap sheet in quantities of acre feet, is that right?
Yes.
And this is the same form that you testified to earlier, only this is an actual completed form, again, with a particular date and a particular month of record. Is that right?
Yes.
And this record shows, because you know how to read these, don't you?
Yes.
Okay. So in the column entitlement less releases or plus distributed releases for the Kern Delta Water District, which is abbreviated KDWD, it shows that that the Kern Island First diversion right reached its monthly cap according to the forfeiture judgment of 2,050 acre feet. Is that right?
Yes.
And again, that's under the column entitlement less releases or plus distributed releases. And then it's got this separate column for Kern Delta, KDWD, right?
Yes.
And then if we look further down in that same column, we see that likewise, the Buena Vista First and the Stein and the Farmers diversion rights reach their respective monthly caps according to the North Kern decision, that being 191 acre feet for Buena Vista First, 12 acre feet for the Stein, and 207 acre feet for the Farmers. Is that right?
Yes. If I can make a quick reference to the testimony of Those numbers, I agree, yes.
Okay.
Those are the cap numbers, yes.
Now, in the column to the left, there are other diversion rights on the schedule, after the James. You see where the James first right is listed? You see the James first?
Yes,
And then we see that there was gross entitlement for certain rights, the Castro, the South Fork, the Buena Vista first, and the James first. You see that, right?
yes,
But all of the other diversion rights lower on the sheet after the James first had no gross entitlement whatsoever. Is that right?
no entitlement to natural first point flow. Yes, correct. That's
Okay.
correct.
So like let's just use the Anderson first, the very next right. So given the river stage of December of 2007, the Anderson first had no gross entitlement. In other words, the river wasn't flowing at high enough levels for them to receive entitlement in order of priority, right?
Correct.
And yet we see that they actually did receive a direct distribution of releases from prior senior rights of 1,113 acre feet. Is that right?
It's kind of small on my screen, but yes.
Okay. And there's a series of other diversion rights after the after the Anderson first that likewise received varying amounts of water in December of 2017, even though they had no gross entitlement in that month of 2017, right?
Correct.
Now, what are the two rights on this record that actually released water to the Kern River in December of 2017?
The Kern Island and the Buena Vista.
And you know that by looking at the column releases to river and then following the columns of the diversion rights, you can see Kern Island released 16,396 acre feet and the Buena Vista released 2,082 acre feet, right?
Yes.
And if Ms. Mullins could scroll up the record a little bit so we can get down to the bottom a little bit. Go slow. There, perfect. That's perfect. The total amount of releases in December of 2017, according to city records, was 18,478 acre feet. Is that right?
Yes.
And that came from the Kern Island first and the Buena Vista first. Do you agree?
Yes.
And the entirety of that Kern River water was released, distributed directly to the diversion rights in order of priority so that the entire amount, that same 18,478 acre feet, was actually diverted and beneficially used. Is that right?
Yes.
And again, so let's look at the James for a second. The James first only had a gross entitlement. In other words, the flow of the river was only high enough to allocate an initial 161 acre feet. You see that?
Yes.
But it actually diverted and used and received a total of 7,291 acre feet, being the gross entitlement plus the releases. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, all of the rights lower in priority to the James first, again, you've acknowledged they had no gross entitlement. In other words, the river wasn't flowing at a rate high enough that under the Shaw Decree, they would receive any water, right?
Correct.
Was that a yes?
Yes.
And yet those rights, each and all of them, did in fact receive Kern River water in December of 2017, as shown on the city's flow and diversion record. Is that right?
Yes.
And now this is a monthly sheet. If I can have Ms. Mullen, if you could please go to, it'll be FTP page 2010. I think. You know, excuse me, it's 2103. No, I'm sorry, I'm got my numbers wrong. I'm sorry, let me get my,
Take your time, Mr. Cuny.
yeah, I'm sorry. I've transposed some numbers. It's 2110. There we go. Thank you. I apologize for the confusion. Now, Mr. Core, just like you're familiar with the monthly recap sheets, you're also familiar with the daily flow and diversion records, correct?
Yes.
And actually, the administration that started long before the city of Bakersfield with the land company, there's always been a daily record and a monthly record and an annual summary, right?
Yes, back to a few years, yes. Yes.
Okay. So this is now a daily sheet, December 6, 2017. And on this day, the James first, the Anderson first, the Meacham, Plunkett, Joyce, Johnson, and Pioneer first had a computed natural flow stage such that they got no water. Is that right? I mean, they had no gross entitlement. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
So the river was only flowing, you can see it was only flowing at a low number, 409 CFS at first point of measurement, right?
Yes.
And that wasn't enough to go down the flow schedule to get to those rights, the James, et cetera. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yet this daily record shows that each of those diversion rights was distributed Kern River water released by the Kern Island, the Buena Vista diversion rights in amounts that are shown under the column releases direct, right?
Yes, correct.
And in fact, each of those rights, like the James first, the Anderson, received their maximum entitlement according to the rate of flow on the sheet of 120 CFS for the James first, right?
Yes.
20 for the Anderson, correct?
Yes.
And then we look at the Meacham, the Plunkett, the Joyce, and the Johnson, all of them receiving their maximum amounts under the diversion rights on the schedule, correct?
Yes.
So this record shows that, there was insufficient Kern River flow on this day for any of the diversion rights for any right after the Pioneer, right? No diversion right received any water after the Pioneer first. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, if you would like, I'll let you review as many of these flow and diversion records that you want. You can direct Ms. Mullins to do this. But are you aware of any other records in December of 2007 that were administered any differently than this sheet that we just now reviewed December 6th? I mean, isn't this the way it's always done?
It is, yes.
And this is the way it was done before the judgment, isn't it?
I'm going to object. The question's vague and ambiguous. This is the way it's always done. It's not clear what he's referring to.
Mr. Cooney, I think you can probably rephrase the question if you would please
Okay.
be a little more specific.
Yeah. So this manner of measuring Kern River flow and distributing those flows to the rights in order of priority is the way the records have been kept before the judgment and for as long as the land company had records. Isn't that true?
Which judgment are you referring to?
I'm sorry, what is your question?
Which judgment are you referring to?
The North Kern decision, 2007 judgment.
And the answer is yes.
Yeah.
Your question.
If Ms. Mullins could please pull up from, again, North Kern 32, go to page, I believe it's going to be earlier. It's going to be 142. It's going to bring us to December 9, 2007. Oh, that's great. I'm sorry to make this so tedious. That was very fast. Thank you. Now, Mr. Core, take a look at this December 9, 2007 record. Do you recall that you actually gave sworn testimony before the State Water Board with regard to this specific day and record back in 2010?
I don't have a specific recollection of the specific sheet.
Okay. Well, I promise you that you did. We see on this daily record, so this is now just soon after the judgment was rendered or the decision was final in the North Kern case. And we see on this daily record a release to the river by the Kern Island First of 229 second feet days. You see that?
Yes.
And then we see again, following that column, all the way down, you see the 229 at the bottom of the column, correct? She may need to scroll down.
You have to scroll. Yes.
A little bit further, Ms.
A little
Mullins.
farther.
Thank you. Yeah, perfect.
Okay. Answer yes.
Okay. So for the entire release to the river by the Kern Island on December 9, 2007, was distributed to the other diversion rights in the order of priority of the Shaw Decree as per the flow and diversion schedule. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that's how it's always been done, isn't it?
Yes.
And so again, then it's always been distributed in the exact same way in order of priority according to the diversion rights, correct?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. And now, and again, this is just one example, but if we went through the rest of the month of December of 2007, would you agree, and feel free to look through this record if you'd like to see the exact same consistent historic practice of the distributed releases going to the diversion rights in order of priority up to the Shaw Decree maximum limits. Isn't that true?
Could you repeat that, please?
Again, this is just one example, but if we went through the rest of the month of December 2007, would you agree, and feel free to take a look through this record, would you agree that you would see the exact same consistent historic practice of the distributed releases going to the diversion rights in order of priority up to the Shaw Decree maximum limits?
Yes.
And that's exactly how it's been done for over 100 years, correct?
Well, this particular example of 2007, the caps were in place. So the numbers for a similar type flow would be different. The distribution would be different.
Okay. But the manner of allocation, distribution, and order of priority up to the maximum limits of the Shaw Decree would be exactly the same. Is that right?
I'm going to object to the question's vague and ambiguous, Black's Foundation. He's giving a pretty broad statement without really us knowing what he's referring to.
I'll sustain the objection in the sense that I think, I'm not sure Mr. Core can testify as to the entire length of the history of accounting. I mean, maybe so, but maybe Mr. Cooney, if you can narrow the question somewhat.
Mr. Core, as far as you know, records have been kept with regard to the daily diversion and use of Kern River water from certainly 1932 until the present in substantially the same form as what we see here on the screen right now. Isn't that true?
I could say during the term of my employment with the city, it was consistent.
Okay. So let me rephrase my question then. At least for the period of time that you have been involved from, I guess, 1980 until the present, this is the way the records have always been kept by the city and its predecessors. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, so far, you and I have reviewed and testified, you testified with regard to flow and diversion records prepared by the city after 2007. I want to show you a record of the Kern River flow and diversion records before the court's decision regarding Kern Delta's judgment of partial forfeiture. If Ms. Mullen, if you could pull up North Kern 98. And yeah, can you help with the orientation? Can that turn or no? Look at you, man. Glad it's you. Thank you. So take a moment, Mr. Core, to look at this. This predates you. I mean, it's 1963. This is a daily Kern River first point flow and diversion record that was during the time when the Kern County Canal and Water Company was maintaining the Kern River records, right?
Yes.
And so, you know, this form is a little bit more simple than our current forms, but it also lists the columns of diversion rights and the name of the diversion rights to the left, correct?
It's a bit fuzzy, but yes, I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah, so it has, you know, the amount as the first column now,
Yes.
and then the name is the second column. And then it has the gross entitlement, you know, the initial flow of the river column, right? That's the fourth column over, I guess, right?
Yes.
And so for this particular day, this is the first day of January 1963, the flow of the river was only 197 CFS. Is that right?
Yes.
Which is not unusual for January, so it's very low. The flow was only enough for the Kern Island first, being the first right on the river, to have an initial calculated entitlement. We see that, right? The 186.
Yes.
And then they released 172 CFS that day, correct?
Yes.
And that entire amount was then minus losses distributed and used by other diversion rights, correct?
Yes.
And so the first right to actually receive water on this January 1st, 1963 was the James First diversion right. That's one of those listed in the 52 agreement, correct?
I believe the Castro was the first.
Oh, you're right. Castro, they got 26. So thank you. Excuse me. Yes. But the James First received 120, right?
Yes.
And that 120, that matches the Shaw Decree amount. And that's the same amount in the 1952 agreement with North Kern and the land company, correct?
Yes.
So this is how the records were administered before the city acquired any rights to the use of Kern River water, correct?
Yes.
If Ms. Mullen, if you could go, it's also in Exhibit 98 to, actually, it's the very last page of that exhibit. It will be a date of December 4, I believe, 1963. That's great. Thank you. Now, again, so this is still one of those Kern County Land Company forms administered by the Kern County Canal and Water Company, correct?
Yes.
And it shows on December 4, 1963, that the Kern Island, Castro, Old South Fork, and Buena Vista diversion rights all released varying amounts of Kern River water that was available to them for diversion and use, but they released it to the river. Is that right?
All in.
The Kern Island first, and the South Fork and the Buena Vista first released water to the river on December 4, 1963.
Yes.
And we know that because that's what the records show. The 165 was released by the Kern Island, the 7 CFS was released by Old South Fork, and 53 CFS was released by the Buena Vista first, correct?
Yes.
And all of that water that was physically available flowing in the river that was released was distributed directly to the other diversion rights in order of priority for their beneficial use, correct?
Yes.
Now, if we went all the way down to the Pioneer first, it only received a partial distribution of its entire right under the Shaw Decree. It's entitled to 130 CFS, but it only received a portion of that on December 4, 1963. Is that right?
That's correct.
And it received a portion that day, even though it had no initial entitlement given the low flow of the Kern River on December 4, 1963, correct?
Yes.
If Ms. Mullen could go to North Kern 99, please. And actually, it'll be the very first page of that exhibit. And it should bring you to the October 26, 1985. So, Mr. Core, this is a period in which it's after the city acquired its assets subject to the 1952 agreement, correct?
Yes.
But it's before the Court of Appeals decision of partial forfeiture of the Kern Delta water rights, correct?
Yes.
And on this day, the computed natural flow of the Kern River was determined to be 306 CFS. Is that right?
Yes.
And we talk about computed natural flow, so it is being computed because of Isabella to eliminate the effect of Isabella. So it is natural flow, albeit computed, right?
Yes.
Okay. So the river was only flowing 306 CFS, and the only right given that slow or low number was the Kern Island first, correct?
Yes.
And they released almost all of it, 254 CFS of their initial gross entitlement, correct?
Yes.
And that entire 254 CFS was then distributed to the diversion rights in order of right of priority, as shown on the flow and diversion record, consistent with the Shaw Decree, correct?
Yes.
So I'll pick on James first. Everybody likes to do that. James first in the Shaw Decree is entitled to 120 CFS. Is that right?
Yes.
On this day, it had no initial gross entitlement because the flow was too small, right?
That's correct. Yes.
But it actually diverted and used the entire maximum entitlement according to the Shaw Decree, 120 CFS. Is that right?
Yes.
And in fact, it wasn't just diverted and used, it was diverted and used by North Kern Water Storage District. And we know that because that's what the column says, entitlement, less releases or plus distributed releases, North Kern, right?
Yes.
Let's, if Ms. Mullen would please, let's go to North Kern 100 and to FT page 6, which should bring us to November 22nd, 1991. That's great. Thank you very much. Now, again, this is another daily sheet, Kern River flow and diversion record, like Exhibit 99, that was prepared by the city before the court's forfeiture decision, correct?
It's November 22nd, 1991. Yes. Yes.
And this daily record shows, like the others you've reviewed, that only the Kern Island First Diversion Right had any entitlement given the low Kern River stage and flow. Is that right?
Yes, it is. Yes.
So, you know, again, the initial gross entitlement, given the rate of flow of the river as computed according to the record, Kern Island had 266 CFS available, released 201 to the river, and the entirety of that supply was diverted and used by diversion rights in order of priority according to the Shaw Decree and the 1952 agreement, for that matter, right?
Yes,
So again, the James First is in the 1952 agreement. It's in the Shaw Decree. It received its 120 CFS, which is its maximum entitlement of flow on a day. Is that right?
yes,
And this record shows that the releases were distributed in their entirety until they were exhausted. That being all 201 CFS was fully utilized by the various diversion rights, correct?
yes,
And again, we see that actually the diversion and use was done in large measure by North Kern. We look at the James First right and the Anderson First and the Meacham and the Plunkett rights. Is that right?
yes,
So we've looked at records after the judgment. We've looked at records by the city before the judgment. We've looked at records by the Kern County Land Company before Bakersfield bought its water rights subject to the 52 agreement. And they're administered in the same manner and method, are they not?
yes.
If Ms. Mullen would please, let's pull up a different kind of record. Bakersfield 77, please, and go to FTP page 109.
Mr. Cooney, could you repeat the exhibit number for us, please?
Yeah, it's Bakersfield 77.
Bakersfield 77, great.
And then I think the jump page is, and actually maybe my notes have goofed me up here. Yeah, I actually want to go to the first page would be FTP 77. I'm sorry, I keep doing this to you.
Is it
Or 75, 75. I'm sorry, 75. Gosh. I'm going to challenge reading my own notes. Okay, thank you. We're there. So, and if you need to see the cover page, Mr. Core, let me know. I will represent to you that this is from the Kern River 2020 Annual Hydrographic Report, and this is the summary page that concerns the city of Bakersfield's records. And I'm gonna goof people. I apologize. I'm gonna goof everybody up again. Let's go to page 57 first, Ms. Mullins. I'm sorry. There we go. Thank you. I apologize to everybody. So again, this is from the 2020 Annual Hydrographic Report, and you're familiar, are you not, Mr. Core, that in every annual report, there are records for Kern Delta, for the city of Bakersfield, for North Kern, that give an annual summary of what has occurred that year in terms of Kern River water supply, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so now on this page, we're within the Kern Delta Water District chapter. And on this page, it identifies the entitlements and diversion for the year 2020 for Kern Delta. Is that right?
Yes, for all canals, yes.
Yeah, for all canals, just as the title indicates. So while the daily records that we've looked at, keep track of the gross entitlement for Kern Delta and the other diversion rights. When we look at this record, it brings forward the Kern Delta entitlement for the year based upon the daily records, and accounts for all of the distributed releases, both gained and lost for that year. Is that right?
Yes.
So the first entry, again, and this is for all canals, but the first entry is Kern River entitlement, and that's the gross entitlement numbers that we see on the daily record sheets, right?
Which line are you referring to?
Okay, so we have the Kern River entitlement number, the plus number, and it,
Okay.
and it right, and it
Yes.
talks about what was the gross entitlement for the all canals of Kern Delta for the year 2020 by month. So let's just use January. So that was the total gross entitlement that was shown from the daily sheets, correct?
Yes.
And then it also separately accounts for the releases that they may have gained because of releases from other rights, correct?
Yes.
And then it accounts for all of the losses, in other words, the releases that they were required to make or made operationally, correct? Is that right?
Repeat that question.
With regard to the losses, this record keeps track of all of the losses that all of the Kern Delta canals made in 2020 by month. Is that correct?
The release loss.
The releases, yes, the
Yes.
release losses. Excuse
Yes.
me. Thank you. Yes. And then this call or this line item, entitlement plus or minus releases, it's all in bold. That's the, as it were, the net math of releases, or excuse me, entitlement, whatever was gained, whatever was lost, that's the net arithmetic, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so it accounts for whatever they may have gained, whatever they've lost, and then that is the amount ultimately that was available to Kern Delta in this year by month, taking into account those pluses and minuses, correct?
Correct. Yes.
So if we look at, and maybe if we can, well, let's just use, I'll just use January as my illustration. So even though there was an initial record of gross entitlement of Kern Delta rights at 23,157, in fact, their entitlement plus or minus was much smaller than that. It was only 17,339 acre feet. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And the same relationship occurs for any of the months. Is that right?
That's right. Yes, correct. Yes.
And if we could now, Ms. Mullen, if we could go to FTP page 75, which should bring us to a City of Bakersfield sheet. That's perfect. Thank you. Making your work hard. Thank you very much. So this page is also from the 2020 annual hydrographic report. And it's the corresponding sheet only for the city of Bakersfield. Is that right?
Yes,
So likewise, it keeps track of the gross entitlement that was recorded in the daily sheets. And that's the first number, river entitlement, right?
yes,
And then it also accounts for any kind of distributed releases that the city of Bakersfield may have received over the months for 2020, correct?
yes,
And then the bold column, entitlement plus or minus releases, does the arithmetic of whatever the net math is, correct?
yes, correct.
So again, I'm just going to use January because that's easy to see on the screen. So the gross entitlement calculated was 1,158 acre feet, but there were distributed releases of 1,238 acre feet. So the total supply entitlement plus or minus releases for Bakersfield in January was 2,396 acre feet, right?
Yes,
And now if we could go also, Ms. Mullen, now let's go to in this same exhibit to page 109, and that should bring you to a North Kern record. Perfect. Thank you very much. And just like the city sheet and just like the Kern Delta sheet, this one is for North Kern, and it accounts for entitlement, and then it accounts for whatever releases may have been received, correct?
yes,
And then it does the arithmetic, and so we'll use January again. So even though the gross entitlement initially in the records was 3,906 acre feet, it also had distributed releases of 4,550 acre feet. So the total amount entitlement plus or minus release according to the city's record was 8,456 acre feet, right?
yes,
And this methodology, I use 2020 as an example, but the annual hydrographic reports, certainly through all of the time that Bakersfield has been keeping records since 1976 till now, this is the way those annual reports have always accounted for entitlement and releases and doing the arithmetic of entitlement plus or minus releases, correct?
yes.
Didn't change because of the forfeiture judgment, did it?
I would say the only changes were made on this sheet format to after 2008 to show the preserved entitlement of Kern Delta on their sheets, but I think that's the only difference. That is the only difference.
Yeah, I think that is the only difference. I agree. So if Ms. Mullins, if you could please bring us to Bakersfield 95. And in particular, I think we're going to be able to go just to the very first page of this. And then maybe we either reduce it or scroll up, or if it could all fit on a page a little bit more. That's perfect. That's good enough for my purposes. Thank you. Now, are you aware that, matter of fact, I guess as Water Resources Manager, you must have either done them yourself or approved them to be done, that the city of Bakersfield annually files statements of water diversion and use with the California State Water Resources Control Board?
At the time of my retirement, we were filing every 3 years.
Okay, every 3 years, and yeah, you're lucky. Now we do it every year, Mr. Core. So at any rate, but you were familiar with that process of actually reporting to the state board the records of diversion of use of rights that were even pre-1914 rights. Is that right? You're familiar with that?
Yes, yes. Familiar.
So we see in this report of 2020 that the city of Bakersfield reported that based upon its pre-1914 claims of rights, the amount beneficially used was 83,382 acre feet. You see that in that column total. You've seen that.
I see 83,382. Is that correct?
83,382 under the column amount beneficially
Yes.
used acre feet.
That's what I see on the form. Yes.
Okay. And that figure matches with the city of Bakersfield's figure that was on the flow and diversion records, for the annual report in exhibit 77 as the total water supply available to the city of Bakersfield in 2020. Isn't that correct? You want to go back to
I'd have to look at that, the 2020 form.
well, you can see the form here, and if you would like to go back
Well,
to
this form, I'm talking about the form in the annual.
yeah, and I'm sorry to bounce back and forth. Let's go back if Ms. Mullins can't. Well, keep in mind this figure, Mr. Core, 83,382, and then looking at Bakersfield 77, page 75. And if you could scroll, or we need to see the right side. We need to see the total column. Can you see that? That total supply.
Excuse me, I don't see it on my screen.
Yeah, I don't either. Can we scroll it, move it left, Ms. Mullins? Oh,
It's interesting because I can see it on my screen, but it may
you
be
can see it. Yeah, what we end up with, blocking information. There, perfect. Thank you. So you see, City of Bakersfield's total supply is 83,382, which includes the releases that were distributed to the City of Bakersfield. You see that?
Yes.
Okay, so that 83,382 includes releases made in 2020. And that same amount, 83,382, is the exact same amount that Bakersfield reported to the State Water Board as the water it diverted and used in 2020 from the Kern River based upon its pre-1914 appropriative rights. See that?
Yes.
So Bakersfield routinely reports to the State Board the waters that have been released to Bakersfield under its water rights when it talks to the State Board about statements of diversion and use. Isn't that true?
I'm going to object with that question misstates his testimony and calls for speculation. He's only been questioned about one statement of diversion and use, not consistently or routinely what the city has done.
Let me rephrase, Mr. Pierce, let me rephrase. Mr. Core, when you submitted statements of diversion and use every 3 years during your tenure, you included not only entitlement, but the distributed releases as part of your supply that you claim to be diverted and used on your pre-14 rights. Isn't that true?
Yes, it is true.
Let's switch topics here a little bit. Ms. Mullen, can you please bring up Bakersfield 106? Can you see that, Mr. Core? Actually, shrink it down a little bit. It was, for some reason, we end up with the, perfect. That's better. Doesn't get blocked. Thank you. So this was a table prepared by you, is that right?
Yes,
And in this table, you concluded that all water released to the Kern River above the court-ordered monthly caps is available for appropriation. Is that right?
this table was to show how much water was available above the forfeiture caps. Yes,
And this table shows, if we look at the line item, well, let's take it a slice at a time. There's a line item that says Kern River flow available to Kern Delta water rights, and it's by year, and that's a total water supply based upon the records. Is that correct?
yes,
And then there's a determination made of all water that is above the court-ordered caps for the rights suffering a loss of water rights, correct?
yes,
So let's just pick on 2020, 30,694 acre feet is what you determined to be water above the caps for all rights for Kern Delta, correct?
yes,
And then you have other columns, one for the city, one for North Kern, and one for Kern Delta, showing all of that very same water actually being diverted by either the city, North Kern, or Kern Delta, correct?
yes,
And that's based upon the records. So your record review indicates that all of that water that you say is above the cap was in fact diverted by either the city, North Kern, or Kern Delta, right?
yes,
So, and that's why that next column, diverted or used, it matches exactly everything above the cap, the exact same figure, correct?
yes,
So this table really just assumes that everything above the cap is unappropriated water in your view.
yes,
But you acknowledge that in fact, the records show that all of that water was diverted by the city, North Kern, and Kern Delta.
I'm going to object. I probably should have objected to the last question as well on the unappropriated issue. I think this question was argumentative. This past question.
I'm going to overrule it. I think I understand where we're going, where Mr. Cooney is going. I think it's appropriate. Is it, maybe you can clarify for me, Mr. Pierce, isn't it your position that, or your client's position that water above the forfeiture cap that was available to the Kern Delta water rights is unappropriated water? Is that?
It is
Did you not
correct,
say
and
that? Okay.
that's why I didn't object to the last question. But now Mr. Cooney is essentially arguing with the witness.
Maybe Mr. Cooney, can you, I'm not sure I now recall the last question. Can you repeat, or we can go to the court reporter for the last question?
I hate to burden the court reporter. Can I have her read it back? And if I need to, I'll rephrase, but I think it was clear.
Looking. But you acknowledge that in fact, the records show that all of that water was diverted by the city, North Kern and Kern Delta.
All right, I think we can, I'll rephrase the question and I don't mean it in an argumentative way. Let's try this. Mr. Core, is it your testimony that the water that was above the forfeiture caps was diverted in the entirety by these other entities, whether it's the city of Bakersfield, North Kern, or Kern Delta?
The records do show that, yes.
Back to you, Mr. Cooney.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Core, we were just looking at 2020, but that's true for every year that is shown on your Bakersfield 106 exhibit. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
Okay. If Ms. Mullins could please pull up Bakersfield 107. Thank you. Mr. Core, this is actually a multi-page exhibit, but I think I can just use this one page to ask my questions. This exhibit 107 was prepared by you, is that right?
Yes.
And like exhibit 106, you have annual tables for each year, and now you have months shown. And in your table that you titled Kern River Water Availability, they all provide for each year that all Kern River water released to the river above the monthly caps as ordered by the court is, in your view, Kern River water available for appropriation. Is that right?
I was asked to come up with the numbers that show how much water had been forfeited by Kern Delta in the forfeiture months.
Who asked you that?
It was part of the process of building the water availability analyses.
And who asked you to do this analysis in this manner?
I would assume it was Colin Pierce.
Okay. So you took his instruction to develop these tables in this manner that showed all water released above the court-ordered caps was available for appropriation. Is that right?
I'm having trouble with the available for appropriation. I was asked to come up with the numbers to show the amount of forfeited water in the forfeiture months that was available.
So what do you mean by available? I assume that does that not mean?
Well, you could. I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
You tell me. I mean, you use the word availability. What does that mean?
Well, in the context of this proceeding, available for appropriation.
Okay. And that means it has to be unappropriated to be available for appropriation. Isn't that right?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that.
Okay. If Ms. Mullins, if you could please bring up Bakersfield 110. And this was one of the exhibits you testified to earlier in the day, is that right?
Yes, yes, it is.
So this was all prepared by you.
Yes,
And you titled this surplus entitlements. What do you mean by surplus?
it was over and above the forfeiture caps.
So like
On the-
exhibit,
on-
oh,
the
excuse,
current-
I interrupted you. I apologize. Excuse me.
I didn't finish my,
Yeah, I
my thought
apologize.
there. It was the theoretical surplus water over and above the forfeiture caps on the 6 months of the year for the Kern Delta rights.
So is it correct that just like exhibit 106 and 107 that you've already testified to, likewise for exhibit 110, your analysis shown in Bakersfield 110 determines that everything above the caps is surplus entitlement available for appropriation. Is that right?
Yes,
Now, were you aware that the hearing officer, after legal briefing, had issued a legal ruling on November 3rd, 2021 with regard to the applicable law in this matter?
no,
Were you asked by Mr. Pierce or anyone to update or revise any of your analysis in your tables, Bakersfield 106, 107, 110, to address the hearing officer's legal rulings?
Well, I'm going to object. He just testified he wasn't aware of the ruling. So I don't know how I can answer that.
Let me rephrase. It's fair to say that you made no attempt to revise or update your analysis in exhibits 106, 107, 110 after the hearing officer's legal ruling. Is that right?
that's right, correct.
Now, in your recent rebuttal testimony, Mr. Core, in particular, that's I think Bakersfield 113, you've claimed that North Kern's witnesses have overstated for a few months how much forfeiture releases were diverted and used by North Kern as compared to the city of Bakersfield. You recall that testimony you put in your written rebuttal?
Ms. Kunze, we haven't presented the rebuttal evidence yet, so I don't know if it's appropriate for him to be cross-examined on it yet.
I think that's right, Mr. Cooney.
Okay, fair
Let's-
enough. And I think that is correct. So I'll wait. I think then with that, I have no further questions at this time of Mr. Core.
Thank you, Mr. Cooney. I'm going to do a time check. That was a long cross-examination, although I think I found it to be quite helpful to go through the charts and everything. It's helpful to me to see several examples of the accounting and how it works in practice. But I want to do a time check and confer with you, Mr. Pierce. I know you mentioned that some of your witnesses may not be available tomorrow, and I want to make sure we get to them. So I wanted to hold a pause. We are now at 2:51 p.m. I wonder if it makes sense, even though this is unconventional, to move away from this panel of witnesses to get to the witnesses that may be unavailable tomorrow, and then return to this panel. I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yes, the witnesses could be available. It just they'd have to be pulled out of meetings and such. So I think we could proceed with the current cross-examination.
Okay, and we'll see how far we get. So I appreciate that check. Mr. Cooney, what do you anticipate, just in general, about the time to cross-examine the remaining two witnesses on this panel? And you are on mute.
Sorry, excuse me. That was the longer by far of the examination. So these next two will be considerably shorter. So I don't know exactly the time limit,
That's fair.
but markedly different, so many fewer exhibits.
Let's do this, however. Let's go ahead and take a break. It has been quite a while. Let's take a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back to the remaining two witnesses on this panel at, it is now 2:52 p.m. We'll come back at 3:02 p.m.
Very
And then
good.
we'll
Thank
proceed
you.
from there. Thank you very much. All right, it is 3:03 p.m. I'm going to look to or listen for a court reporter to let me know when you are ready to proceed.
I am ready to proceed. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to give just a few minutes, well, not minutes, a few moments for everyone to rejoin on their cameras and on their audio. And I believe, Mr. Cooney, the next witness, are you planning to cross-examine Mr. Chianello?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Well, we can proceed as soon as Mr. Chianello rejoins us. Then we can proceed.
I am here.
Great. Mr. Cooney, you can go ahead and get started, please.
Very good. Art, good to see you again. We see each other often. How are you?
Doing well. Thank you.
Okay, now, is it correct, Mr. Chianello, that you're not a licensed attorney? Is that right?
That's correct.
And likewise, you've had no formal legal education or training from any accredited law school. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And you have never been qualified in any court of law or administrative tribunal as an expert witness competent to testify and provide opinions with regard to matters of California water rights or contract interpretation. Is that true?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And I know were here when I was examining Mr. Core, and we put up Exhibit 41, and that is the 1952 agreement. Are you familiar with that agreement?
Yes, I am.
But you were not personally involved as a witness to the drafting or the execution of that 1952 agreement for use of water rights. Is that right?
No, I was not there at the drafting of it, but it is one of the agreements we use here at the Water Resources Department on a daily basis.
You weren't even born in 1952, were you?
I was not born there.
Okay. Now, like the 1952 agreement for use of water rights, you have familiarity with the city's agreement 7636, which is the agreement between the city and Tenneco. Is that right?
I'm familiar with that, yes.
But just like the 1952 agreement, you were not personally involved or a witness to the drafting and the execution of that agreement between the two parties, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
You have no direct personal knowledge as to the intention of the parties when they actually signed that agreement, do you?
Just from what I've read within the agreement itself.
You've read the agreement, but other than that, you have no personal knowledge as to the parties' intents with regard to that agreement. Isn't that true?
Just from what I've read, yes.
Okay. You weren't even working for the city of Bakersfield in 1976, correct?
Correct.
In fact, you were in high school in Southern California in 1976.
That is correct.
In your written testimony, Mr. Chianello, Bakersfield 8, and I don't know if you have it at your fingertips or whether you need it pulled up. Do you have it?
I have it in front of me.
Okay, so why don't you just go to paragraph 60, and if the hearing officer wants it up, that's fine too, but if the witness is familiar, what's your preference? Why don't we do this? Can Ms. Mullins, can you please pull up Bakersfield 8 and bring us to paragraph 60, which is on, I think, the 16th page of that written testimony? Yeah, just a. There we go. And if you could reduce it a little bit so it's not obscured. That's perfect. Thank you very much. So, Mr. Chianello, again, this is your written testimony. You're familiar with paragraph 60, correct?
Correct.
And then at line, I'll call it line 17, let's call it, you say, quote, the releases, quote, have been treated by all parties as a separate, new, identifiable and quantifiable block or supply of water that falls outside of the historic pre-1914 water rights structure on the Kern River and outside of the customs and practices defined in or as the law of the river, quote. You see that?
Yes, I do.
Now, you're not telling the hearing officer under oath that North Kern has ever agreed with that, are you?
No, this is my understanding
Okay.
of what I
So,
wrote
but
here.
but you say all of the parties have had that understanding. North Kern doesn't have that understanding, does it?
Well, subject to the court decision, they probably do. And I would also say it's the way the way the Kern Delta summary sheet is quantified, that it shows it as a separate. It shows it as a separate amount of water above the forfeiture caps, which is in the monthly or in the annual reports for all to see.
But let's be really clear. Are you saying that Kern Delta Water District agrees that it's a separate, new, identifiable and quantifiable block that is above rights? Or are you saying that that's their opinion too?
I can't speak for them.
Okay. And you can't speak for North Kern, can you?
No.
So, and is that consistent with how the Kern County Canal and Water Company records have identified waters released to the river in the past?
Because since the forfeiture caps, the way the records have been kept have been modified slightly.
They've been modified to account for the court-ordered forfeiture of water rights of the Kern Delta rights, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
If we could please, let's take a look at, well, actually, I don't need to look at these exhibits. Let me just ask you this question. And if you want to see the exhibits, we can. In your written testimony, again, that's Bakersfield 8. You explain in paragraph 70 that it's, quote, your opinion that water above the forfeiture caps or forfeiture releases is a separate, new, and distinct supply of water that should be considered unappropriated water, correct?
Correct.
And that was likewise the analysis that you included in your water availability analysis, that everything above the caps or forfeiture releases is a separate, new, and distinct supply of water?
Correct.
Let's take a look at so that was included in both Bakersfield 5, which is the initial water supply analysis, and then 6 is the supplement. Is that right?
I'm sorry, you'll need to repeat that, please.
This conclusion of yours that everything above the caps is a separate, new and distinct supply, that was also the analysis that you use in both the original water availability analysis and in the supplement. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So if we could please, let's go to Bakersfield 6. And the very first page, just the cover page, actually, of Bakersfield 6. Scroll down. Yeah, perfect. Scroll, perfect. That right there. That's great. Thank you. So this is the cover page of the August 2019 supplement to the water availability analysis prepared by the City of Bakersfield, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And it was actually prepared and approved by you, and that's your licensed engineer's stamp and signature. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
If we go to page 4, of that, excuse me, actually page 5. A little bit. There we go. Thank you very much. That's it. The one and right there. That's fine. So you see this. It's the large paragraph that starts off. The city maintains that. You see that?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Why don't you, if you want, read that to yourself so you're familiar with it. And then I just want to ask you one question with regard to that list of positions that the city maintains.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so you've had a chance to read that, Mr. Chianello?
Yes.
And that paragraph is an accurate summary and analysis, excuse me, is an accurate summary of the analysis, methodology, and conclusions that are contained in the City of Bakersfield supplement to the water availability analysis that you prepared. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay. So your analysis that is, contained within Bakersfield 6 is built on the position maintained by the city that as a matter of law, the water released by Kern Delta constitutes unappropriated water. That's the first point, correct?
Correct.
And the second point is more junior Kern River rights, including the rights held by Kern Delta and used by North Kern, that are lower in priority than the capped water rights, have no legal right to divert and use water released by Kern Delta as a result of the forfeiture caps. So the unappropriated water cannot simply be absorbed by the more junior rights based on the demand for water, correct?
Yes, correct.
And then the third proposition, we don't need to read it, is, but that's the position of the City of Bakersfield, all summed up in this one paragraph in this exhibit Bakersfield 6. Is that right?
I'm gonna object because I think that misstates his prior testimony, and I think that's also potentially argumentative. I mean, the document speaks for itself. I don't know if this is the Bakersfield's entire position in this proceeding.
I'm going to sustain the objection. I think the summary was a little bit broad, Mr. CUNY,
Okay.
asking Mr. Chianello for his I mean, this document is something he drafted. I'm not sure it's, in any case. The objection is sustained, but you may try again.
No, I think the document does speak for itself. Let's turn to the next page on this exhibit. And there's a paragraph on the next page, Mr. Chianello. It's actually the third paragraph down. Thank you, Ms. Mullins. That's exactly where I want to be. And in that paragraph, your report that you signed and stamped says, the analysis shown in your water availability analysis, the city has not subtracted prior existing water rights from the amount of water available, or amount of available water, because more junior Kern River rights do not actually have a right to divert and use the forfeited available unappropriated water, or at least do not have the right to divert and use the water in the absence of a permit or other authorization from the state board, quote. So is it fair to say that this water availability supplement applies this principle in its methodology?
Yes.
Now, on the very next page of this exhibit, water availability supplement, page 6, there is a there's a table. You see that table?
Yes.
It's towards the bottom a little bit. Yeah, it's really a little bit more. Thank you very much. So that's a table that you included in the supplement. And similar to Mr. Corr's exhibits, there's a line there that talks about total supply available to Kern Delta water rights. And then there's values for the years 2008 through 18 of water above the cap. You see that?
Yes.
And so this analysis depends on the proposition that all water above the caps is unappropriated and available for permit. Is that right?
It's identifying the value of or the volume of the water for every year above the forfeiture caps, and could be considered or should be considered it to be unappropriated water.
And it does not, as that earlier passage indicated, it does not take into account any diversion and use by any other Kern River rights on the flow and diversion records. Is that right?
Yes, it was just meant. Yes, that is correct.
Now, when you prepared this water availability analysis, both the original one, you did that one in 2015, is that right?
Yes.
And you then did this supplement in August of 2019, correct?
That's correct.
Did you determine that once a senior user, such as the Kern Island First or Buena Vista First, Steiner Farmers rights, the diversion rights, appropriative water rights held by Kern Delta, that were required to, let me rephrase. Is it your understanding that the court has determined that the Kern Delta rights Buena Vista, Kern Island First, Buena Vista First, Stein and Farmers have suffered a partial forfeiture of their water rights above the caps that were stated by the court?
Yes.
And in your analysis that is in your water availability analysis, did you determine that once these senior rights held by Kern Delta had reached their monthly caps, that each successive junior right, like the James First and the Anderson First and all of the other rights that are shown on Bakersfield 32 on the flow and diversion record, did you determine that they had the right to release water up to their respective maximum paper entitlements until the entire release supply was exhausted?
This chart isn't showing that. This chart is just showing the volume of water that was available above the forfeiture caps between the years of 2018 or 2008 and 18.
And I appreciate that the table's more limited, but in your overall either original or supplement water availability analysis, did you consider and provide that each successive junior diversion right, like the James First appropriative right, and all of the others on the flow and diversion record shown in Bakersfield 32, had the right to the release water up to its respective maximum paper entitlement until the entire release supply was exhausted?
I'm going to object that the question is vague and ambiguous, lacks foundation. The documents we've submitted, including the original WA and supplement WA, speak for themselves. I also object that it's vague and ambiguous when Mr. Cooney says you contend, because it's not clear whether he's asking if Mr. Chino personally believes this or if he's asking for the position of the city of Bakersfield.
So Mr. Cooney, I think I'll sustain, I'm going to sustain the objection, but what I'd suggest, and if you can do it on the fly, is to point to particular testimony. I think that would be helpful here to connect this. I'm not sure if you have it in front of you.
Well, I do
I'm
have.
sorry, I shouldn't say testimony, either testimony or the statements in this report.
Well, and let me ask the question more generally, and then we'll move on because I'm almost finished here. Is Mr. Chianello, in the analysis that you prepared in the water availability analysis, both the initial and the supplement, did you follow the directive of the Court of Appeal that each successive junior right had the right to release water up to its maximum paper entitlement until the entire released supply was exhausted?
Yeah, definitely object to that question to the extent it misstates and mischaracterizes the Court of Appeal opinion, calls for a legal conclusion, lacks foundation. And I also think it's argumentative, and to the extent that Mr. Cooney is claiming the Court of Appeal decision says something it doesn't say.
I'll sustain it to the extent that I'm not, I think the interpretation of the Court of Appeals decision is at issue here. Mr. Cooney, I think I understand your point. If you'd like to continue on this line, I'll give you another opportunity, but I do think you've made your point.
Yeah, and I'm content that you understand the point. Let me ask one last question, Mr. Chianello. You prepared your water availability analysis in 2015. You supplemented it in August of 19. The hearing officer issued a ruling on November 3rd, 2021 to address the legal standards to be applied in the Phase 1A hearing. Did you revise your analysis tables and exhibits to reflect the hearing officer's legal ruling?
Yeah, these are the original tables.
I have nothing further for Mr. Chianello.
Thank you, Mr. Chianello. Unfortunately, we're not necessarily done with you. There may be further cross-exam once we're done. Mr. Cooney has completed his cross-exam. Mr. Cooney, do you have questions for Mr. Chavez?
I do. I have just a few.
You may proceed when you're ready.
Ms. Kunze, I
Yes.
did want to clarify, and I think you alluded to this, that I do want to do redirect, but I was going to wait until after this panel is done before I did my redirect.
Yes, my intention for redirect would be after the completion of all cross-exam. There may be cross-exam from other parties. And then you would have an opportunity to redirect.
So after all of our witnesses,
Not after all of your witnesses, after all of the other parties have had a chance to cross-examine these three on this panel.
got it. Thank you.
Yes. Mr. Cooney, over to you.
Okay, very good. Hello, Mr. Chavez. I've not had a chance to meet you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
And you've heard these questions for other witnesses, but I need to ask them of you, given your written testimony. You're not a licensed attorney, are you either?
No,
Okay. And likewise, just like the other two witnesses of the city of Bakersfield, you've got no legal education or training from an accredited law school?
If I say anything, I'm going to unmute it. So we can turn it up if you want. I just have my headphones on.
Mr. Pierce, we can hear you. Oh, now you're muted. Thank you.
to answer your question, no.
Okay, and like the other two city witnesses that have testified, you've never been qualified in any court of law or administrative tribunal as an expert witness competent to testify and provide opinions with regard to matters of California water rights or contract interpretation, correct?
That is correct.
Given your testimony, I have to ask you this question. Have you ever read the 1952 agreement?
Yes.
Other than reading it, did you have any other direct personal familiarity with it when it was drafted in 1952?
No.
I'm highly certain that you were not born in 1952.
No, I was not.
Okay. And you have never worked for the Kern County Canal Company, or excuse me, Kern County Land Company, have you?
No, I have not.
And you've never worked with any person that was employed by the Kern County Canal and Water Company, have you?
No, I don't think so.
Just like the 52 agreement, you had no personal involvement with regard to the 1976 agreement between the city and Tenneco West, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. I had no personal involvement.
Okay. And have you read that agreement?
Yes.
Other than reading it, do you have any other personal knowledge as to the party's intentions that signed that agreement in 1976?
No.
If we could have, Ms. Mullen, if you could pull up Bakersfield 80. Now, do you recognize Bakersfield 80 as a city of Bakersfield, Kern River First Point Flow and Diversion record? Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
Now, you were not working for the city back in December of 2008, were you?
No, I was not.
And you didn't prepare this record, obviously. That was done by your predecessors. Is that right?
That is correct.
It shows that the computed natural flow on this day of 2008 was 437 CFS, right?
Yes, that is correct.
And it also indicates that the gross entitlement that was initially determined, given that rate of flow, was sufficient to reach, in order of priority, the rights of Kern Island, Castro, and then the last right that was listed is the James first, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
That's right. So it's indicating that given that amount of flow, there is water that at least in theory could satisfy in part the various diversion rights listed there in order of right of priority, correct?
Yes, of the gross entitlement.
Yeah, the gross entitlement. That's the phrase that is used in the form, isn't it? Gross entitlement.
Yes.
And then it shows, like we've seen in earlier records, that Kern Island first released the entirety of its supply that day, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And then it shows that there were releases also by South Fork and Buena Vista first. And we see the total releases at 384 CFS, second foot days, right?
Yes, that is correct.
And the entirety of that available supply was distributed directly in order of priority to the rights on the flow and diversion record, consistent with the Shaw decree, correct?
Yeah, I believe it was released to the next available junior right with capacity. Yeah.
Right, right. And so, for example, the James first that has a right under the Shaw decree and under this form to 120 CFS was in fact allocated and distributed 120 CFS, correct?
Total between the gross
Yep.
entitlement and the
Right.
releases, yes.
But it didn't get any more than 120, right? Which is the limit, that's the maximum entitlement for that water right, correct?
That is correct.
And then it shows that other diversion rights from the Anderson all the way down through the Johnson got their entire maximum entitlement according to this record and the Shaw decree. Is that right?
That is correct.
But there was only enough water available that day for the Pioneer to receive some, but not all of its entitlement. It only got 101 CFS as compared to its 130 maximum right under the Shaw decree, correct?
Correct.
And all of that water is shown to be diverted and used by North Kern Water Storage District, according to the records, entitlement less releases or plus distributed releases, correct?
Yes, 391.
391. Now, this December 2008 record is typical of the records that have been prepared both before and after the 2007 North Kern forfeiture decision. Isn't that true?
Yeah, I believe the same customs and practices were kept in place pending a decision from the State Water Resources Control Board.
Nothing was changed pending a decision from the court, or excuse me, from the state board. That's your testimony, right?
Correct.
I have nothing further for Mr. Chavez.
Thank you, Mr. Cuny. Just to confirm, does that complete your cross-examination of these three witnesses on this panel?
It does, and as you correctly pointed out, I do have things about rebuttal, but of course that was not a timely inquiry that I started. Excuse me.
Yes, understood. Thank you. At this point, I will turn to the city of Shafter. Do you have any questions for these three witnesses?
No, hearing officer Kunze, no questions for these witnesses.
Thank you. Next on my list, I have Buena Vista Water Storage District.
Ryan Bezerra for Buena Vista Water Storage District. We have no questions for these witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Bezerra. Kern Delta Water District.
Craig Carnes for Kern Delta Water District. We have no questions either.
Thank you very much. Kern County Water Agency.
No questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Rosedale Rio Bravo Water Storage District.
No questions.
Thank you. Tulare Lake Basin Water Storage District.
No questions. Thank you.
And Mr. Keats with the public interest groups.
No questions. Thank you.
Thank you. That was efficient. Mr. Chavez, Mr. Chianello, and Mr. Core, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for your testimony. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Pierce, you have redirect. I forget so quickly. I can't thank you yet. Mr. Pierce, if you, do you have, actually, let me take a moment and see if I have questions. I think I had, let me look back at my notes. Give me just a moment, and then I'll give you a chance to redirect, Mr. Pierce. I did have a question that came up for Mr. Core, and it has to do with my understanding of this accounting. We went through it quickly, and it wasn't really the point of Mr. Cuny's cross, but it raised a question in my mind, so I apologize. Excuse me while I flip through. I believe it was Bakersfield 77. It's the exhibit that shows the 2020 diversion records. So Ms. Mullen, yes, I wrote it down as Bakersfield 77. Ms. Mullen, if you could please pull that up. And my question will be for Mr. Core once I find the right page. And then I think I want to go to page 57. What I'm looking for is the records for the Kern Delta Water District. Yes, there it is. Good. And if you would please blow it up for me, because I lost my eyesight in law school. Okay, that's perfect. Now I wanted, Mr. Core, I wanted to understand, it looked to me like this, this chart includes an additional line that was not present on the charts for the city of Bakersfield and North Kern, for example, the very first line, which says Kern Delta preserved entitlement all canals. Can you clarify for me what that is, what those numbers are in that row, please?
Those are the cap months, the forfeiture capped months.
Okay, so the numbers in those in that row are from the court's decree that culminated in the 2007 judgment?
Yes.
Right, okay.
Yes.
And then how does that cap, let me see if I can phrase this question. So then the next row down, the Kern River entitlement, that is the entitlement that the gross entitlement calculated for Kern Delta, you might say disregarding the caps imposed by the court.
That's correct. Yes.
And then the next row is the release gain, which is diversions that Kern Delta made in addition. Is it in addition to their gross entitlement or within the scope of the gross entitlement? In addition to their gross entitlement?
Yes, it is.
So when calculating, I may need your help here. How is the imposition of the cap reflected, or is it reflected in these three rows? Kern River entitlement, release gain, and release loss, or is the cap not factored into those numbers in any way?
The cap, it would be reflected in the line release loss.
So release loss, that's the amount of water that was, it includes water that was released because of the imposition of the caps.
Yes.
So then this bottom line, the entitlement plus or minus releases, that row, which is I see as the summation of the, adding the first two rows and then subtracting the third. That is the amount of water that Kern Delta actually diverted. Is that accurate?
Yes, it is.
Even though that's in excess of the cap imposed by the court? I mean, I don't mean this in an argumentative way. It is, Kern Delta diverted more water than the cap imposed by the court?
The caps didn't apply to all their canal rights.
I see. Thank you. And this is why I thought I was confused, and now I understand.
So, so if I can further explain,
Yes, please.
The line release gain are junior rights of Kern Delta that benefited from a senior right releasing.
Yes, and I recall now that Kern Delta had junior rights that were not affected by the caps. Thank you, Mr. Core, for that clarification. That was very helpful. I don't have any additional questions for any of the witnesses. So I will turn to Mr. Pierce. If you have redirect for your witnesses, please go ahead.
Thank you, Ms. Kunze. Colin Pierce again for City of Bakersfield. I do have a few redirect questions, and I will go in the same order that Mr. Cooney addressed the witnesses. And I have to bear with me because I'm going to go back to a few of the exhibits that Mr. Cooney mentioned. Mr. Core, Mr. Cooney asked you about the 1952 agreement and your familiarity with it. Is it correct that you have actually, during the course of your employment with the City of Bakersfield, that you applied and administered the contract, the 1952 agreement?
Yes.
And do you feel like you were experienced and knowledgeable with regard to the agreement?
Yes.
And your experience and knowledgeable with regard to the administration and application of the agreement?
Yes.
And then would that be true with other agreements that govern or impact the diversion use of water on the Kern River, including the 1976 Bakersfield Tenneco agreement?
Yes.
And I don't know, well, actually, I don't know if we need to call it the exhibit, but Mr. Cooney showed you a blank diversion sheet with various colors on it for various diversion rights. And the colors differentiate between rights which are used by Bakersfield, North Kern, and Kern Delta. Do you recall that testimony?
Yes.
The rights that are shaded to correspond to rights used by North Kern, does the City of Bakersfield actually own those rights?
Objection calls for a legal conclusion as to the interpretation and differences between the 52 agreement and the 1976 agreement. We put forward testimony that they took all their rights subject to all of those rights and obligations. It's beyond his competency to answer.
I'm going to overrule the objection, but with the objection noted for the record and the caveat that the testimony will be considered in light of his experience and knowledge. Mr. Core, you can respond, if you will.
I'm recalling the colors on the chart. I think North Kern was the yellow, I believe.
Yeah, actually, it's Bakersfield 32. So I don't know if you want to call that up or not. That might be helpful.
Why don't we? Ms. Mullen, if you please pull up Bakersfield 32.
Okay, it wasn't yellow. The rights that are shown shaded in my screen showing them as kind of a pinkish color are rights owned by the City of Bakersfield that are used by the North Kern.
And those are the rights that are listed in the 1952 agreement, is that correct?
Yes,
And they're shaded in that pinkish color to show that these are the rights that North Kern utilizes under the 52 agreement, is that correct?
yes,
Does Bakersfield on occasion receive water pursuant to those rights also?
yes, it occurs when there are months where North Kern in the 52 agreement exceeds a diversion cap.
And that diversion cap is in the 1952 agreement?
Yes, it is.
The North Kern has its own diversion caps in the 1952 agreement, and when they exceed the caps, does the water come back to Bakersfield?
Yes, it does.
And is that, strike that. All right, that's all I have for Mr. Core. Mr. Chianello, I just want to clarify something. Mr. Cooney asked you about paragraph 60 in your direct testimony, which was part of exhibit Bakersfield 8. Perhaps we could call that up, paragraph 60 by Ms. Mullins.
That's Bakersfield 8.
Yes, paragraph 60, which is on page 16 of the exhibit.
Thank you.
So Mr. Cooney asked you, Mr. Chianello, about whether North Kern and other parties believed that the, let me look at the actual testimony here, that believed whether the water available to Kern Delta's rights in the months when the caps were in place, but not subject to diversion, constituted a separate, new, and identifiable and quantifiable block of water. And I believe the question's related to whether North Kern believed the same thing. I want to clarify what your testimony doesn't say believes, it says what?
It has been treated by all. I
have your testimony.
I'm sorry, it's being blocked by the video. Has been treated by all parties as a separate, new, identifiable and quantifiable block or supply of water that falls outside of the historic pre-1914 water right structure on the Kern River and outside of the customs and practices defined as a law of the river.
So just to clarify, you weren't testifying, or you're not providing testimony as to North Kern's legal position or what they internally believe. You were testifying as to how the rights have been administered and treated on the river, correct?
Objection argumentative. He's just channeling legal arguments through his testimony and then arguing it yet again.
Mr. Cooney, I'm going to overrule it and allow us to keep going. I think this focus on the language is appropriate, but I do understand the point, Mr. Pierce, so we can move along.
I'm moving on. And that was all I had for Mr. Chianello. Mr. Chavez, you indicated that, I just want to clarify one point, that you testified that if junior rights have entitlement, they don't divert forfeiture release water. Is that correct?
Yeah, if they have full gross entitlement, natural entitlement, they don't divert any forfeiture releases.
Mr. Cooney asked you a question about forfeiture releases being diverted by the next most junior right, but just to be clear that the way the river is administered, forfeiture releases are not diverted by the next most junior right. They're diverted by the next most junior right without any water. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct.
Thank you. That's all I have for you, Mr. Chavez.
Thank you. At this point, I think that completes our questions of these witnesses. Is that correct, Mr. Pierce?
Yes, that is correct.
But now it's appropriate for me to thank the witnesses for joining us. Mr. Chianello, Mr. Core, Mr. Chavez, thank you so much for joining us today. Your testimony was very helpful, and we appreciate your time spent with us today.
Thank you.
With that, you're excused. Thank you very much. And then Mr. Pierce, I believe, let's see, it's 3:54, so I would like to keep going. And I believe what we had talked about doing was presenting a panel consisting of Mr. Clegg and Mr. Anthony. Is that correct?
Hold on, I'm just doing a technical assessment here. What I would request, though, is we take maybe even just a 2 or 3 minute break, because we need to make sure the other next two witnesses are available. I know they are available, but I don't want everybody to sit here while we get them, make sure that they have the link and all that. And the next two witnesses would be Christian Clegg and Rick Anthony.
Yes.
And actually, I'm hopeful that, given the fact that their testimony has been reduced, that we can get through maybe the remainder of our witnesses by the end of the day.
Great. Well, let's go ahead and take, I'll give you a 6 minute, I'll give you a 6 minute break, or 5 minutes now. It's 3:55. Let's reconvene at 4 p.m. and we'll go forward from there.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Recorder is checking in. Ready to go.
Wonderful. Mr. Pierce, are your witnesses ready?
Yes, they, yes, they are.
I see Mr. Anthony.
And Mr. Clegg should be there in a second.
Sure thing.
And we are going to have, oh, there's Mr. Clegg. So we are going to have Mr. Clegg go first.
Great.
And then we can have Mr. Anthony, and then they can both be available for cross-examination.
That sounds good. Mr. Clegg, if you would please unmute your microphone and go ahead and raise your right hand. Mr. Clegg, do you swear or affirm under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes.
Thank you. You may proceed, Mr. Pierce.
Thank you. And again, for the record, this is Colin Pierce, the attorney for the city of Bakersfield. And once more, could you state your name, please, for the record, Mr. Clegg?
Christian Clegg.
And
Can you
is
spell it
exhibit,
for the record, please?
CHRISTIAN
Thank you.
and Mr. Clegg, is exhibit Bakersfield 12 a true and correct copy of your written testimony in this proceeding? And I'll say subject to certain redactions, which we learned about this morning.
Yes.
And is exhibit Bakersfield 19 a true and correct copy of your statement of qualifications?
Yes.
What is your current position with the city of Bakersfield?
I am the city manager for the city of Bakersfield.
Can you provide a brief summary of your employment and educational background, please?
Sure. I received a master's of public administration from the University of Kansas with an emphasis in city management, and pursued several important mentorships or fellowships into the city management field, one in Johnson County, Kansas, one in Tacoma, Washington. I've been in the city management field for the past 15 years, 5 years with the city of Tacoma, with generalist roles in the city manager's office, and 9 years in the city of Stockton, ultimately as a deputy city manager there. And I've been with the city of Bakersfield now for nearly 2 years.
And what are your duties and responsibilities as city manager?
Yeah, my responsibility as a city manager is, under policy direction, of course, from the city council, to oversee all of the city's operations, and that includes the water resources department. I appoint and supervise all of the department heads, with the exception of the city attorney. I prepare the draft annual budget for the city council's consideration and oversee the day-to-day operations of the city, essentially ensuring that all ordinances and council decisions are implemented and carried out on a citywide basis.
Thank you. And I would have asked you otherwise what issues or questions you were asked to address, but that has been modified because some of what we asked you to address has now been excluded from the record. So I'm now just going to ask you to give a brief summary of what we understand remains of your testimony at this. And I will, again, point out for the record, as Ms. Kunze said, the hearing officer said, the testimony that has been excluded for today's purposes was merely deferred, and we hope to introduce it again in the future. So could you now give a brief summary of the testimony that the hearing officer has concluded is relevant for this phase of the hearing?
Yes, thank you. So Bakersfield currently has 403,000 residents, and it is the 9th largest city in the state of California and 48th most populous city in the United States. We have implemented a number of different measures to conserve water, increase public awareness of water conservation, and take other measures to address our long-term water quality and conservation needs. We've adopted and implemented conservation measures in response also to recent drought conditions and the orders and proclamations from the state of California and the governor's office calling for significant water reductions. Bakersfield and its residents historically have not had and currently do not have access to reliable or economical or clean alternate sources of water
we have relied on the Kern River as our exclusive water source, either through direct surface water or through groundwater, created by recharge from the Kern River. So diversions by and on behalf of various water districts through the complex system of canals and diversion facilities that are here in place have resulted historically in a mostly dry riverbed throughout Bakersfield, downstream of our Callaway Weir. The loss of the river has severely diminished and threatened the city's recharged and banked groundwater supply, despite many efforts to try and keep that in good condition. And it's also resulted in damage and threats to the quality of our local water supply, our local environment, including vegetation and fish and wildlife in and around the river, as well as aesthetic and other recreational opportunities around and in the river itself. And to protect the river and our local groundwater supply and the environment in and around the river, we've had a long-range goal of maintaining a consistent and sustainable flow of water in the Kern River. Since the 1960s, the city's also worked towards a goal of having minimum annual flows in the Kern River. We've utilized the Kern River channel and banks for other environmental purposes. We've also set aside really nice open space areas and trail systems and native vegetation, habitat, and green belts around the river area. And ultimately, Bakersfield's efforts to protect and preserve the Kern River have had significant interest from our local residents and community members. We've received significant written and vocal support from residents of the city and the surrounding areas. We've also had local citizens recognizing and embracing the multiple far-reaching benefits of a restored and revitalized Kern River. It's one of the topics for which we've received more public comments at city council meetings than others. And residents of the city have consistently noted that a restored flowing river is critically important to the economic success and pride, identity, and well-being of the entire community.
Thank you, Mr. Clegg. That concludes your testimony. Is that correct?
It does. Thank you.
Or that the summary of your testimony, of course. Thank you. And Ms. Kunze, after Mr. Anthony testifies, Mr. Clegg will be available for cross-examination. So our next witness is Rick Anthony.
Thank you, Mr. Anthony. And if I can ask my team to, I can see you on my small screen, but I'm going to ask my team to pin you to the larger screen virtually. But while they're working on that, Mr. Anthony, will you please raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Please proceed, Mr. Pierce.
Good afternoon, Mr. Anthony. Once again, for the record, my name is Colin Pierce. I'm the Special Water Counsel for the City of Bakersfield. And for the record, could you state your name again, please?
Sure. Good afternoon, Rick Anthony. That's RICKANTHONY.
And is Exhibit Bakersfield 13 subject to certain redactions, which we learned about today, a true and correct copy of your written testimony in this proceeding?
Yes, it is.
Is Exhibit Bakersfield 20 a true and correct copy of your statement of qualifications?
Yes, it is.
What is your current position with the City of Bakersfield?
I am the Director of Recreation and Parks.
Can you provide a brief summary of your employment and educational background, please?
Sure. Prior to coming to Bakersfield, I was the Director of Recreation and Parks for Anne Arundel County, Maryland, for approximately 11 years. Prior to that, I was a certified arborist and ran my own tree care company for about 5 years. And prior to that, I had several different positions in local government on the East Coast. I'm also a certified park and recreation executive and have a bachelor's degree with Lancaster Bible College.
And how is it that you came back to Bakersfield?
Well, position opened up and I threw my name in the hat. I was actually born and raised here. I've been gone for about 30 years and just very fortunate to be able to come home with my elderly parents and hopefully and prayerfully just kind of end my career here in my hometown.
Thank you. And again, as with Mr. Clegg, I'm not going to ask you what issues or questions you were asked to address because that gets into some of the issues and testimony that has been deferred. So I'll just ask you to give a brief summary of the remainder of your testimony today, please.
Sure. Bakersfield Recreation and Parks Department provides a number of amenities to our residents here in Bakersfield and really speaks to the quality of life issues for the entire city. We have 61 public parks, 4 public pools, 13 spray parks, 2 sports complexes, and 2 skate parks, among other facilities. We have developed and implemented a number of projects in the past intended to increase the use and enjoyment of the Kern River. Most significantly, through the Kern River Parkway Plan, the city has developed an extensive bicycle trail system that allows hiking, running trails, equestrian trails, and preserves open space. The city has also purchased lands adjacent to the river to ensure the lands are protected, remain in public ownership, and open space. As a result, Kern River Parkway Plan, as well as later additions to the project, it is possible to run and bike along the Kern River from the mouth of the Kern River Canyon to the base of the Sierra Nevada foothills, all the way to Interstate 5 in the western portion of San Joaquin Valley. The Kern River Parkway further includes a number of parks along the river, as well as land dedicated to the native habitat and preservation of vegetation.
Thank you, Mr. Anthony. That concludes your testimony, is that correct?
That's correct.
Ms. Kunze, both Mr. Clegg and Mr. Anthony are available for cross-examination.
Thank you, Mr. Pierce. I will turn first to Mr. Cooney. Do you have any questions for these 2 witnesses?
I am not going to examine, but Mr. Stroud in our office will. So
Thank
he'll
you.
handle this.
Good.
Thank you, Hearing Officer Kinsey. I'm going to start with a few questions for Mr. Clegg. It's an honor to meet you, sir. I would first like to ask you about your testimony with regard to the city's urban water management plan and the other testimony about the municipal use of Bakersfield's Kern River water. I'd like to refer you to your written testimony. We could put that up on the screen. And we have in paragraphs.
I'm sorry, Mr. Stroud, do you happen to have an exhibit number for us?
Oh, yes, I do. I'm sorry. That's Bakersfield 12.
Thank you.
And if we could go to paragraph 11. And if you'll see, particularly in paragraphs 11 through 14 there, you have a description here of Bakersfield's municipal water system and the system operated by the California Water Service Company. Is it correct that these are uses that Bakersfield makes of the Kern River water that it currently diverts?
I would say that it is correct that these are uses of Kern River water that the city deploys, yes.
And water that Bakersfield diverts as gross entitlement and water that it diverts as distributed releases are not differentiated in that. It's all used for these various purposes, correct?
I'm going to object the question to vague and ambiguous and lacks foundation.
I'm going to overrule it. I think, Mr. Clegg, if you understood the question, please answer it. If you don't, we can ask for clarification.
I was going to ask for clarification.
All right.
I should ask you a foundational question then. Are you aware of the practice under which the Kern River records are administered, where certain water rights receive an allocation based on the river stage that we note as gross entitlement, and then based on releases made by other water users, it's also allocated distributed releases?
I'm aware of the process at a high level and aware of the policy considerations, but not the details of the record keeping.
Okay, so your testimony here then is just generally speaking, the city of Bakersfield uses its Kern River water for these purposes, these municipal purposes.
I'm going to object to the extent that mischaracterizes his testimony.
I'm sorry, I did not hear the end of that question. Could I have the question repeated? So your testimony here then, generally speaking, the city of Bakersfield uses?
It's Kern River water for these various municipal purposes.
And I was going to object that the testimony speaks for itself. The question's overly broad as well.
I think I'm going to sustain that objection. I think, Mr. Stroud, the testimony does speak for itself. And I think I understand your point as well. So
all right,
I suggest we move on.
That being said, then I have one brief question for Mr. Anthony, and I think I'll be done. Mr. Anthony, it's a pleasure to meet you as well.
Same here.
In your testimony, you testify about the Kern River Parkway plan and some of the other recreational projects and amenities available around the city of Bakersfield, some of which make use of water from the Kern River. And just to clarify, those are also uses that Bakersfield makes of its existing Kern River water supply, correct?
Again, I'm not exactly sure what the question says. Can you repeat that again?
So some of these recreational amenities that you discussed involve the use of Bakersfield's Kern River water, and that's a use to which Bakersfield puts that water, correct?
That would be correct.
And I understand you also have some other testimony about potential future use of additional Kern River water that I was going to ask you about, but we're going to be deferring those questions to another day. So I think at this time, I actually don't have any further questions for either of you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stroud. I will do this on shorthand. Is there any other party who has questions for these two witnesses? Please speak up. I can't see all of your faces in this current view. Then I don't have any questions, so I'll turn back to you, Mr. Pierce. Do you have any redirect for either of your witnesses?
I do not have any redirect, Ms. Kunze.
Thank you. And with that, then, thank you, Mr. Clegg. Thank you, Mr. Anthony, for being here. I appreciate your testimony, and you are excused at this time. Mr. Pierce, it is now 4:18 p.m. I think we should press forward, as you suggested, and see how far we get. With that, are your next witnesses that looks like Dr. Cullen and Dr. Schwartz, are they ready to present their testimony?
I believe so. Hopefully my partner is going to put them on the screen in any second now.
Great.
Oh, there's Dr. Schwartz. So at least I guess we're going with him next.
Oh, great. We can start with Dr. Schwartz. Dr. Schwartz, if you would please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you, Mr. Schwartz, and you may proceed, Mr. Pierce.
Thank you. Dr. Schwartz, good afternoon. For the record, my name is Colin Pierce, Special Water Counsel for City of Bakersfield. Could you state your full name for the record, please?
Sure. Full name is Ken Schwartz, SCHWARZ.
And is Exhibit Bakersfield 13 a true and correct copy of your written testimony in this proceeding, subject to certain redactions?
I think mine is Bakersfield 10, not 13.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. Correct. Sorry about that. So is Exhibit Bakersfield 10 a true and correct copy of your written testimony, subject to certain redactions?
Yes.
Okay, and you also have a copy of your statement of qualifications. Is that correct?
Yes.
And is that what number is on that document?
Oh, I'm actually looking at that as part of inside of Bakersfield 10. But are you referring to a full separate document?
I believe it's a separate exhibit.
Let me pull it up then.
I believe that is Bakersfield 17, just to move things along.
Thank you. I was hoping for you to jump in. Is Bakersfield Exhibit 17 a true and correct copy of your statement of qualifications?
Yes.
And what is your current employment position?
I'm currently senior consultant at Horizon Water and Environment.
Could you provide a brief summary of your employment and educational background?
Sure. I've worked as a professional consultant since 1993. I've focused most of my career on stream, river, and watershed management issues, including topics of erosion, flood management, water resources, and water supply. Education, I received a PhD and master's degree from UCLA, from the Department of Geography. My areas of research and specialization were in riverine hydrology and geomorphology, that's landform analysis. And I have an undergraduate degree in regional development from UC Berkeley in 1988.
And you've been retained as an expert witness by the city of Bakersfield in this proceeding?
Yes.
And have you done other work in the past for the city of Bakersfield?
Yes.
Can you describe that work, please?
Sure. I assisted the city of Bakersfield in developing the draft and final EIR documents for the Kern River Flow Municipal Water Use Program. That process was back in around 2010 to 2012, and then again in 2016. I've also assisted the city of Bakersfield in providing opinion or review as part of the process in developing their application to the State Water Resources Control Board.
And were you involved in the 2009 hearing at the State Water Resources Control Board involving the fully appropriated status of the Kern River?
Yes, I was.
And then what were you asked to do in connection with the city of Bakersfield? And I do want you to state your assignment as you understand it, even though based on the evidentiary ruling today, some of the work you did in connection with that assignment has been deferred.
Right. So for this assignment, I was asked to mostly focus on presenting my work in developing the EIR documents for the Kern River Flow and Municipal Water Use Program. Much of that for this morning's guidance is no longer relevant for this phase, but perhaps deferred to a later phase. That said, some of the testimony that I did provide, the written testimony, is still relevant, and that was describing maybe historical conditions and present conditions.
Thank you. And can you now give a brief summary of the portion of your testimony that is, as you understand it, applicable to this phase of the proceeding?
Sure, and I'll keep it brief.
And can you speak slowly? You're very fast spoken. Thank you.
Yeah, I know. I'm not so good about that. Okay, we'll start off with just a statement here that historic diversions along the Kern River and flows from the Kern River historically have resulted in a mostly dry riverbed downstream of the Callaway Weir. And these historic diversions of Kern River flows, not only did they reduce direct water flows, but they reduced the recharge of groundwater beneath the Kern River. So this reduction in groundwater recharge, together with local pumping operations over the years, has historically resulted in depleting and lowering the aquifer beneath the Kern River. So that's just kind of a historic condition. Since the 1960s and 70s, the city of Bakersfield has undertaken several planning studies and developed plans and reports to manage the Kern River as an important resource for the city and its citizens. There's several plans and reports, and in those planning documents and studies, they've identified opportunities to improve municipal water supply, ecologic conditions along the Kern River, improve water quality of the groundwater beneath the Kern River, increase recreational opportunities, and to provide kind of an overall better environment for the residents of Bakersfield. So to continue.
And does that conclude the summary of your? Oh, sorry.
Oh, I just have a little more.
Okay,
so
sorry about that.
Yeah, to support these long-term kind of objectives and goals, the city then developed its Kern River Flow and Municipal Water Program around 2010 and 2011. And I helped develop the CEQA EIR, which was initially completed in 2012. The EIR was then recirculated in 2000.
Hearing Officer Kunze, I think we're going to have to interpose the objection that they're now venturing into future in the program that is not yet implemented. It's a proposed program. I think he's not by design, but I think he's inadvertently stepped beyond the scope of your rule.
Let me, I mean, I think as I understand, this was a description of what some of your assignments and what you were asked to do. So I will allow it in with that limitation. I understand your concern, Mr. Cooney. But just to move along with this, and Mr. Schwartz, just be aware of it, but I understand it in describing what it is you were asked to do. I think this is fine. We can move through this, and then we'll just be aware of that in the substantive testimony. Thank you. Please proceed, Mr. Schwartz.
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, so the CEQA, the EIR was initially completed in 2012. It was recirculated. A recirculated EIR document was completed in 2016, which time the city approved the program. I won't say any more about what was in the document. But what is relevant also historically here is that over many years now, local citizens have recognized and strongly supported the multiple benefits of a restored and revitalized Kern River. And Bakersfield residents have expressed the support at multiple public meetings through verbal comments, but also written comments, and also sending thousands of letters and comments to the city and also to the state board over the years. And so through all those comments, we've received a lot of support for the city's program and its application to appropriate water for the Kern River.
Dr. Schwartz, does that conclude the summary of your testimony for today's purposes, at least?
Yes.
Thank you very much. And again, Dr. Schwartz will be available for cross-examination after we call our final witness, Dr. Cullen, who I see is available on the screen.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Dr. Cullen. If you would please unmute your microphone and raise your right hand. Dr. Cullen, do you swear or affirm under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. You may go ahead, Mr. Pierce.
Thank you. For the record again, Colin Pierce for the city of Bakersfield. Dr. Cullen, could you state your full name for the record, please, once again?
Stephen J. Cullen.
Can you spell your name also, please?
Stephen. J is my middle initial. Cullen, Cullen.
Is Exhibit Bakersfield 11 a true and correct copy of your written testimony in this proceeding, subject to certain redactions?
Yes, it is.
And thank you. Is Exhibit Bakersfield 18 a true and correct copy of your statement of qualifications?
Yes, it is.
What is your current employment position?
I'm currently a principal hydrogeologist with Daniel B. Stevens and Associates, and I've been with the firm for 17 years.
Can you give us a brief summary of your employment and educational background?
Educationally, I received a PhD from the University of California, Santa Barbara. The dissertation topic was a hydrogeologic subject. I received a master's degree from Montana State University in soil physics, and I have a bachelor of science degree from University of California, Davis, in hydrology and soil science. I'm a registered professional geologist in the states of California and Idaho. I'm a certified environmental manager in the state of Nevada, and I am a certified professional soil scientist with Soil Science Society of America. That status is currently in a retired state. I have over 44 years of experience as a geoscientist and hydrologist for government agencies, as an academic faculty member of the University of California at Santa Barbara and Montana State University, and as a private consultant for local, state, and federal governmental agencies. And I've worked for private industry clients also all on a variety of agricultural, environmental, and hydrogeologic projects. I have a reasonably extensive list of professional publications and presentations as presented in my statement of qualifications, and I've provided expert hydrogeologic written and oral testimony in a number of litigation matters. In 2012, I was the principal project hydrogeologist of the technical hydrology report that was an appendix to the Kern River Flow and Municipal Water Program environmental impact report. In 2013, I provided expert testimony in a trial in a case between North Kern Water Storage District versus the city of Bakersfield regarding the history of groundwater level changes in the vicinity of the Kern River and the impact of groundwater recharge on groundwater levels. In 2020, I provided written testimony referenced in a motion regarding that same case. Since 2017, I've been the project principal of a project to develop a coupled groundwater and surface water model for the entire Ventura River watershed. All that work's being done for the water certification and public trust section of the State Water Resources Control Board Water Rights Division. Using that same flow model, there will also be a transport model developed for the Los Angeles Regional Water Quality Control Board to support development of a TMDL standard for nutrient loading of the Ventura River.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen. You actually anticipated and answered this next question I was going to ask, which is I was going to ask about your past experience and work for the city of Bakersfield. And did your answer cover all the work you've done in the past for the city of Bakersfield?
Well, largely related to this matter, I have also assisted them in various matters such as well rehabilitation and some other miscellaneous hydrogeologic projects related to water production and recharge.
Okay. And what issues or questions were you asked to address in your written testimony in this proceeding?
I was asked to describe groundwater conditions beneath the Kern River in the vicinity of the city of Bakersfield within the Kern County subbasin that has been described as critically overdrafted by the California Department of Water Resources. I was asked to describe the relationship of flow in the Kern River to groundwater recharge to the aquifers beneath the river in the city. And I evaluated the distal extent of the effects of groundwater recharge via the Kern River and the impact of Kern River recharge on groundwater quality in the aquifers beneath the city.
Thank you. And can you now provide a brief summary of the portion of your testimony which you understand is still relevant for this phase of the proceeding as opposed to the deferred part of your testimony?
Yes. Yes, because precipitation is low and evapotranspiration high, direct precipitation in the valley is not a significant contributor of recharge or flow in the Kern River. Most flow in the Kern River originates in the Sierras. Snow melt from the Sierras is impounded and stored in Isabella Reservoir. However, Isabella Reservoir does not have enough storage to capture all of the high flows during the wet years or to provide full allocations of water during periods of prolonged drought. The city recharges the aquifer with Kern River water to store water that cannot be stored in Isabella. Flow into the Isabella Reservoir upstream of the city generally begins in March, peaks in about May, and reaches base flow in August. The city area includes the Kern River channel between the first point of measurement to the northeast to the second point of measurement to the southwest. The aquifer between Bakersfield essentially functions as a storage tank. Water is placed in the aquifer tank by the process of recharge from Kern River flows, and it is withdrawn from the aquifer by the use of extraction wells. Kern River water percolates to the underlying aquifer and forms a mound of water. That mound dissipates as the mound water moves from higher to lower elevations in the subsurface. Thus, the percolating water moves away from the river and recharges the aquifer directly beneath the river and also at locations at a distance from the river. Profiled groundwater presented in my 2012 report for a variety of years between 1993 and 2006 indicates that the recharge benefit beneath the city, as indicated by the influence of the recharge mound, extends northwest of the Kern River by as much as approximately 10 miles, and southeast of the river by as much as approximately 5 miles. The degree of impact varies from year to year depending on the amount of flow that's received in the river. Due to the high quality of Kern River water and the rapidity of recharge, the groundwater beneath Bakersfield is generally of high quality. However, the Kern Fan Monitoring Committee stated that nitrogen, nitrates specifically, TDS, and uranium concentrations are generally higher in the shallow groundwater in areas distant from the recharge areas. In 2012, I analyzed wells owned and operated on behalf of the city of Bakersfield. 23 of 198 wells operated for Bakersfield tested at or above the notification limit for 1,2,3-trichloropropane. Flow in the Kern River and resulting recharge maintains a groundwater gradient that helps prevent water in the contaminated areas from migrating toward the river and areas of groundwater recharge and production. The Kern Fan Monitoring Committee also reported that arsenic concentrations in groundwater have become of greater concern due to the lowering of the maximum contaminant limit, the MCL, and are generally higher in deeper groundwater. Thus, the Kern River recharge contributes to the maintenance of high quality water produced from the aquifer.
Does that conclude this portion of your testimony, Dr. Cullen?
It does.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Ms. Kunze, both Dr. Schwartz and Dr. Cullen are available for cross-examination.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Cullen. I'll turn to you, Mr. Cuny and Mr. Stroud. Do either of you have questions for these witnesses?
I do not, Mr. Stroud.
I do not.
Thank you. I will turn to the other parties as a group. Do any of you have questions for these witnesses? Please make yourself known, as I can't see all of you on my screen. Thank you. Then with that, I believe, Mr. Pierce, we've completed the testimony of these witnesses.
Yes,
And
that's all yes, that's correct.
thank you. And Dr. Cullen and Dr. Schwartz, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your testimony today. I appreciate you being here. At this point, Mr. Pierce, does that conclude the City of Bakersfield presentation of case in chief evidence in this phase 1A of the hearing?
Yes, subject to the deferred testimony, of course, and we obviously need to deal with exhibits at some
Yes.
point, which we would request that we deal with tomorrow morning, perhaps. Just we
Yes.
do need some time to figure out what is still in and what may be deferred until a later time.
Yes, I agree with that and was going to make the same suggestion. So I'd propose that we address that issue probably first thing in the morning before we move to North Kern's witnesses. So that will be my intent. At this point, are there any other housekeeping issues, maybe from you, Mr. Pierce, and then I'll turn to Mr. Cooney.
I guess I did want to point out, and maybe Ms. Ainsley, you can jump in and correct me. We mentioned earlier today that we were filing some pleadings today. I think we did file the pleadings today.
Yes,
so
I did see them
wanted-
come in. Yes,
Okay,
thank
I
you very
just-
much. I saw those and I will review them. So that we'll be prepared to address those issues tomorrow. Although I think my plan is to address those issues after we've heard from North Kern and their witnesses.
Okay, then I think I don't think we have anything else.
Thank you, Mr. Pierce. Mr. Cooney, can you think of any other housekeeping issues that we should address before tomorrow?
The one that I had in my mind, you just captured, and that is that we need to address the administrative record matters. And so I haven't looked at whatever was filed today. We'll look at that. And then I agree with you that's probably the matter towards the end of our process tomorrow that will wrap up the matters of exhibits for Bakersfield. We'll do our direct and all of those exhibits, and then we'll have this administrative process to review. That sounds right.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Cooney. And then I will also mention, I think tomorrow we need to talk about, as I recall, we hadn't talked about closing briefs unless I'm misremembering from our pre-hearing conference. So we also need to address that, which we'll plan to do at the end of the hearing.
That's correct.
Are there any other housekeeping issues from any of the other parties that you would like to raise? So with that, I will close the hearing for today. Thank you so much to all of you for being here and for, as always, for your professionalism and working through this testimony, important testimony and issues. And I will see all of you at 9 a.m. On Zoom. Thank you very much.
Thank
Very
you.
good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Have a good
Ms.
evening.
Kunze.